Okay, we'll go ahead and get started today. I'd like to thank everyone for joining. So, what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about how to track costs in OpenAir, and there's lots of different ways we can track costs. So, we'll talk about some of those and some of the options. We'll talk a little bit about what is a cost center, how does that help with capturing costs and really bucketing costs. What are some of the other options around user costs, around labor and some of the other non-labor cost options, and a little bit about what some of the reporting recommendations here. So this is kind of our agenda for today. So, you run a professional service organization, right? You want to track your costs generally, and so your costs can come from multiple options. So obviously, your most heavy cost is your labor cost, and generally that's coming in through hourly folks entering on their timesheets. You also, may have expenses that you want to capture. So back when we used to travel, having travel expenses, airfare, and other project-related costs come through. And then lastly, you may have costs that are project related but are not labor or travel expense. So you may have third parties costs that are incurred as a result of performing project work, and you want to track those. So we'll talk a little bit about all these items in the upcoming deck. Um, let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about cost centers. I think people don't think about cost centers when they think about cost, but cost centers are a really powerful way for bundling and grouping costs and assigning costs correctly in the system. And so a cost center is basically a tag you set up in OpenAir, and that tag can be aligned with multiple objects. So a user can belong to a cost center, clients, projects, tasks, etc. So all of these items can be inherited by a cost center. And we'll talk a little bit about why you would set this one way or another, but it's a very important aspect of getting OpenAir. So generally, cost centers from a cost perspective are generally going to be from timesheet entries and receipt entries. And so you need to determine the rules in the cost centers of how you want to capture those costs when the time is entered. So for example, I belong to cost center A, but I work on a project with cost center B. So the question then becomes is when I run reports and I group all my costs by cost center, where does my cost fall, right? So if no matter what, I always hit cost center A, my home cost center, then that cost would get inherited from the user tag. But if the project's going to absorb the cost from a reporting perspective, then we would want the project to first absorb the cost if there is a cost center on the project. And then if there's no cost center on the project, then it would default back to the user. So if you look at the screenshot here, this is kind of what we're doing here. We're saying for time entry, first look at the project. If there's a cost center, assign that cost center, tag the time entry, tag the cost to the project. If there's no cost center, like if it's an internal project where there's no cost center, you have multiple cost centers hitting a project, then it would then step back to the user's default cost center. And you have to order these appropriately. So project in this example is going to be the first, and you can change the order in which it hits, but this is generally what we see. And it's the same for expense receipts. The value of cost centers we call sticky values, right? When I enter a task, enter time entry, pick a project, or pick a task, all of those values get stuck to that time entry, including the cost center. And so it's good because you can then include the cost center in all sorts of reports, which is what it really does, and transactional data reports. But you need to be aware that if I had the wrong cost center or if the cost center changes, you need to be aware of the timing of that cost center change because you want it to be applicable to the time it changed versus just changing it and not understanding that it's not going to impact any time entry or expense reports that were entered prior to the change. So it does take a little bit of coordination to make sure that the cost center value is updated so the transactions have the right value. So keep that in mind. Another way to bundle costs and reports is user entity tags. So what is a user entity tag? It's basically a custom field with date parameters in OpenAir, and these are at a user level. So I could say that I was in cost center A I'm currently in cost center A, but in first quarter of 2020, I was in cost center B, and you can have what our current value is versus what previous value is, and we can track in and out of cost centers there. And then you get that date effectivity. And so, user entity tags are really a great tool for being able to control folks in and out of different tag groups based on a date. So that's a real pro of this is by being able to control the dates and even update the dates if need be to make sure you get the right reporting. And we see this a lot, and I've heard this if you've been to any of our utilization webinars, where these tag groups are really important for getting folks to fall in and out of utilization reports correctly. The con is it's not a sticky value. So if you make a change, it will change everything in that date from a reporting perspective. The other con is it's only at the user level. So as we saw earlier with cost centers, we can apply cost centers at multiple levels of the organization. But for user entity tag, it's really just at a user level. So it's really good for saying I was in this department or I was in this cost center. Now I'm in a different one. But that only really gives you the value is if you only care about the user's cost center or the user's department in that case, and not the transactional data. So very useful, may not be the best for costing reporting. So let's talk about how do we get labor costs. On the user record, there's a separate cost table. And this is where we're all aware you can store costs. And then if you do any sort of cost adjustments or cost updates, we can then store historical values of costs. So in this example, this user has a current cost of $90 an hour, but for a short time in April, he or she had a cost of $73.10. And so when you run a report and you're running profitability report based on a specific date range, you can do it. There's a couple of different reporting values we'll talk about later in the slide deck to decide if I want to use the current cost or if I want to use a combination of the historical and the current based on the time frame I am reporting on. The other thing to note is access to these costs are done at the role level. So on an OpenAir role, you can give access to users. You can also give access to costs. And if you don't have access to costs, then trying to run reports on costs will not be available to you. So you have to think through your cost strategy and which roles are going to need to be reporting on what costs and what level of costs. Speaking of cost levels, OpenAir does have the ability to enable 3 different cost levels. And when you have all 3 enabled in your account, these are all switches, you do have the ability to determine which roles have which access to which costs. So this is something you'll need to, again, think through as an overall costing and profitability reporting strategy. So you might ask, why would I need more than one cost? Well, I have this conversation all the time with customers, helping them put together their cost strategy. So what I've seen from a lot of customers is they're really afraid to put real HR related costs in OpenAir because they're afraid people can run reports back into costs, and that's confidential information and cause problems. So what we see typically is a lot of times where we'll take level 1 cost, which is the primary cost, and we'll we'll use that one to really drill down into a salary derived cost factor. And then we can use level 2 costs to potentially do a banded blended costs that's more accessible to a greater number of roles. So for the salary based, maybe only directors and above can run those reports with those values in. But for blended rates across different regions or different job codes, those are more accessible to maybe project managers and other folks that can run those. So they'll still be directionally correct from a profitability reporting, but they won't be down to the salary derived values that you can get with using cost one. Another clever thing I've seen we've done with customers is use one of the costs as a target bill rate. Um, and this really is good if John Doe's target bill rate's 250, and we take one of the cost values and rename it and store John Doe's 250 target bill rate. I can now run reports and say, what did he actually bill versus what should he have billed by taking his hours times his target bill rate cost. And now I can see what a lot of folks call this is realization, is how do we bill versus how did we want to bill, and what's that delta. So realization percentages are a very common KPI for professional service organizations, and the costing using one of the levels of cost as a target bill rate is a great way to achieve that. Another use here is, if for any of you using incurred versus forecast rule, you'll know that it's a cost-based percent complete, but a lot of times they don't want costs. They don't want the cost to actually be factored into the calculation. So what we've done there is we take one of the costs and we store $1 in the cost record. So then it becomes an hours over hours calculation for deriving revenue based on the different participants inside of the project. So another clever usage of cost levels. So adjusting costs and cost override. So occasionally we run into where customers say, the costs, everyone's has a default cost in the system, but a lot of times you'll get a scenario where you might have multiple costs because maybe a contractor is giving you one rate for one project doing one type of work, and then another rate for another project doing different types of work. But I may have a default rate that I get used for all the other work I do. So in those scenarios where you can do that, we can assign a cost override. So that will help. You can do that on the project level. You can do it also on the task level. Another reason to adjust, another way to adjust costs is for salaried employees. So in this scenario, I work overtime. Nobody works 8 hours a day anymore recently. So at the end of the month or at the end of the week, I've exceeded my 8 hours a day and maybe in billable work. And if you take my 48 hours that week times my user costs, it's costing the report will show that I was 48 times my cost, but in actuality I'm a salaried employee, so I am not actually getting paid, and so the company is not actually costing. So in that scenario, you will have overcosted the reporting. So there's a way we can adjust. The way we can do this is a trick. It's an old report called OpenAir Historical Utilization Report. It's an advanced report. It's really a good report for this, and it's the only one you can actually do adjustments within. So let me show you what that looks like real quick. So if you go to advanced reports, you can see percent historical utilization report. And then when you're configuring the report, you need to go through, you need to think about what time frame do we want to run this report for. We generally recommend looking at it monthly. So it's calendar months, where we run a report at the end of the month after all the time's been entered and all the month-end processes happen. And then we go in and we say, okay, show us all the folks, run a report for all the folks, and let's show their utilization. And if anybody is greater than 100% utilization, we want to leave them in the report because we want to do a timesheet adjustment. I also have seen clients do this weekly. so that you can do it in any time frame. You just have to be consistent. You can't do it weekly, 1 month, and then do it monthly, because you'll be crossing over time frames, which OpenAir won't allow you to do. But you'll need to, filter the report for only those that you want to, get the cost adjustment applied. And then you just need to configure it like you would a utilization report. So what time gets factored into the numerator? What is the denominator? So it calculates what the percent utilization should be. When you run the report, you'll get a list of users with different utilization percentages. And in this example, Larry Nelson and Jack Gates are at 130% utilization based on how I set the report up. So then what I would do is go back to the report, and I would filter on only Larry and Jack, because I don't want to, or you could actually filter anybody that's, less than 100%, if that's the thing. So because 100% folks, you're just going to use their costs and, set it to divided by 1, which won't change their cost. So it won't affect anything. But the 130 and the 118 rather, will basically adjust the cost for that period to lower the cost so that you get more accurate cost reporting. And so once you run this report, if you go up into the tips section, the light bulb at the top, and then there is a click here to adjust users loaded cost. Now this is actually a setting that needs to be enabled in your account. So if you don't have this turned on, there is a switch you have to go through support to get turned on. But once it's turned on, then you'll see this click here option, which will bring you to the next screen, which is, do I want to override existing costs, or do I want to create new ones? Why would I override existing one? Well, let's say you made a mistake, or you just want to rebaseline because some extra timesheets came in and you'd already done this, and you want to go ahead and reset the cost for a period. So in that scenario, you would rerun your utilization report, check the box, and you would reset those values for that period. If you are doing this for the first time for a period month end, then you would just go ahead and run the cost adjustments without checking that box, which would then set the value of the cost adjustment. So on the user record, it would show that for the month you applied this to, their cost was X, and that X will be their standard cost divided by the utilization overage, so 1.3, for example, which would then reduce the cost for that period. But your current cost would not remain the same. So you're only adjusting it at a time period basis. And one other thing to note, the only cost you can adjust in this manner is the level 1 or primary cost. So levels 2, 3 are not able to be adjusted. So think about that as you're thinking about how your costing strategy should be. So I think we covered a lot of these best practices. We want to limit the costs, especially if you're putting salaries. Also limit for who can actually do these adjustments by the role. We want to make sure we determine the frequency of these adjustments. Again, I generally recommend monthly, but they could be done basically any type of period, depending on how you're set up. And then also determining how to calculate the percent, the utilization that's used to ultimately adjust the costs. And just remember, if it's 100, if it's greater than 100, it's going to lower the rate. If it's less than 100, it will actually increase the cost for that period. And I've had customers where they want to increase the cost to cover the actual cost amount for a period of time. So that can be a valid strategy depending on what you're trying to achieve. I talked about this earlier, jumped the gun a bit, but cost overrides, multiple rates for a subcontractor. We can set these at a project level and a task level. You can transfer costs potentially for intercompany or interdepartment resources. So you can use one of the 3 costs to store a intercompany transfer costs and maybe update those on a per project or per task basis. And then potentially, overriding target bill rates at a task or a project. And these are all at a user level. So on a project, you have a loaded override that you can set at a user level to say on this project, this user's cost, either primary, secondary, tertiary, is going to be set at this rate. So when time is entered, the cost will then, it will use the project first if there is one. If not, it will default to the user cost. And when you are reporting on costs here, there are two generally cost values in summary reports. There's actual costs and current costs. So actual costs will use the monthly adjustments if there is one. Otherwise, it will use the current costs. I'm sorry, I had that backwards. Actual costs will use the current costs. Current costs will use the override costs or the current cost where it applies. So just keep in mind when you're doing reporting, you grab the right value to make sure you're getting the right costing. Expense reports, we talked about another way to get costs into the system. You can set up expense reports several different ways. You can have expense reports on a per project basis. You can have expense reports with multiple projects. You can have receipts associated to a task as well. If you need more detailed reporting, there's expense policies we can set in place for how to handle different special circumstances, per diems, so forth. So there's a lot of different functionality and features in OpenAir's expenses, all of which will be able to be reported on at a project level or even at a task level if you go down to the task to get more granular cost reporting. Third-party purchases, OpenAir has a purchasing module. It can be a separately licensed module if you don't see it in your account. So you have to ask your account manager. But there are a couple of different purchase order types in OpenAir. There's something called a quick PO where I just want to add a cost to a project. And so a lot of times this is a quick and easy way to get costs in quickly. We had legal fees, or we had to rent computer equipment in order to fulfill this project. We want to get those costs in to OpenAir, and a lot of times these costs are integrated into OpenAir through another system as well, so or uploaded through a CSV upload. So there's a lot of different ways to get the costs in. And then there's also a fuller use of the purchasing module where you go through a full purchase request and purchase order creation with fulfillment. So in this scenario, you start off with I'm requesting to purchase some sort of items from a certain vendor. That goes through an approval process. Once it's approved, purchase order gets generated. And then as you receive invoices from that said vendor, you can start to fulfill the purchase order. And as you fulfill the purchase order, then those costs then get applied to your project. So it's a much more elaborate way to manage third-party costs through a full request option and a full purchase and fulfillment option. And so, again, depending on what you're trying to achieve, we have work customers that are using both. And you can use both together too. They don't have to be one or the other. You can intermingle quick POs and full purchase orders in OpenAir depending on the requirements. So reporting, again, we want to make sure that you think about the role. If you have costs in the system and you have any sensitivity to those costs, you want to think about the role of each individual. They won't be able to run reports if there is a cost in there that their role does not allow them to access. Make sure you're picking the right timesheet cost value, actual cost versus current costs. Also, if you're adding in purchase orders, fulfillment, make sure you're bringing in the purchase order fulfill POs into your report. And then obviously on your expenses, make sure you're pulling those in usually by the receipt date if need be, or you can do it by the expense report date into it as well, depending on how you want to pull those in. So in summary, there's a lot of options in cost tracking in OpenAir. You can track transfer and cross charging, revenue targets, profitability, salary and actual, as well as target revenue. So a lot of different use cases there that go beyond just pure costing. Costs are more than just timesheets. They're very, they're intricate to determining reporting and profitability and all that contribution margin KPIs that are prevalent inside of professional service organizations. and make sure you come up with a good cost strategy and adhere to policies and procedures, and make sure think about permissions and roles, and overall what you're trying to achieve. And once you think through all that, it will kind of dictate how the costs get set up. So that's the end of today's presentation. Thanks everyone for joining. Appreciate it. You all continue to follow Top Step and all the different ways we are out there. And obviously, if we can help in any way, please reach out to us.